what we see here is a war for the sphere of influence war between great powers. And what happened, Armenia conceded this corridor, so Turkey and Azerbaijan can now join. It is my conviction that in the future they will be able to gradually take over the rest of Armenia, because Azerbaijan is saying you are Western Azerbaijan, so you don't really belong here anyway. So this is a major win for Azerbaijan, Turkey, for Israel, and for the United States. And this is a major blow to Iran and Russia.
Hello everybody, this is Pascal from Neutrality Studies, and today I'm talking to Arthur Katchikian, a political scientist and IR scholar, and Pietro Shakarian, a lecturer of history at the American University in Yerevan. Both of them are Armenian, and both of them have a long history of studying their country and the United States and global politics. So what's currently going on with Armenia is what we want to discuss today. Pietro, Arthur, welcome.
Pascal, it's wonderful to be on the show again. Thank you. And it's great to be with Arthur, as always. So
I've had you both on my channel before separately, and I really wanted to get your insight, because a lot has happened in Armenia now, right? And Arthur, you were directly impacted by the recent, very autocratic, totalitarian methods of the Armenian government. Can you maybe fill us in of what happened to you in the last couple of weeks?
Well, I'll give you a few highlights and then cede to Pietro. And then if you guys want to ask more questions, we can go into it. Basically, Armenia is now going through a period of Stalinist-style repressions and terror. We have arbitrary detentions, arrests, open threats from the so-called democratically elected leader of a democratic revolution, supported, by the way, by the West. He recently said, "The government is me." I think he is seeing himself as Louis XIV. He said, "I will annihilate the opposition." He actually said that. "I will cut their tongues off." The West is watching on, just watching, doing nothing, and supporting him, by the way. Macron said, this is done in a quest for democracy. This is a quest for democracy. He's doing this to strengthen democracy. It's really nauseating. So basically, we have mass arrests, political prisoners now. 2 of our archbishops were arrested for saying certain things years ago that were completely taken out of context and manipulated. We had a businessman arrested. All he said was, "We will support our church our own way." And they interpreted that as a call to violence, and they arrested him. The courts are turned into a joke. They're basically, there's no justice. There's just the will of this leader of this gang, who said recently, "There is no judge in Armenia who will dare disobey me." So basically, anyone who tries to speak up is being shut down, arrested, intimidated, including your humble servant. I was kind of massively attacked by the pro-government journalists. Just one day, they just staged this massive attack. It was like Pearl Harbor. And then they shut down my Facebook page, and they threatened to press criminal charges against me. And all of this is done by the so-called free media, sponsored by the so-called democratic West. Tens of millions of dollars were pouring into Armenia precisely for this purpose. Hundreds of journalists were trained to support democracy and human rights, and this is what they're doing now, participating in a Stalin-style repression campaign. This is my bit, and I'll hand it over to my esteemed colleague.
I think Arthur is 100% on point. What we are seeing today is effectively a revival of kind of, the mass political repression we saw in the 1930s in Armenia, when Lavrentiy Beria, who was the leader of Soviet Georgia, installed his cronies Amatuni and Hachik Mokhtisi in Armenia to launch these terrible repressions against people like the poet Yegesh Shadens and Axel Bakuns and others. And that's what we're seeing. We're seeing kind of a revival of that, and really fundamentally really anti-democratic behavior on the part of this government. And but it's not like par for the course, because this government, this government has effectively betrayed democracy. If we go back to the whole history of the Karabakh movement, the Artsakh movement of the late 1980s, the epicenter of that movement was the self-determination, the democratic rights of the Artsakh Armenians. By this government recognizing, and this prime minister recognizing Nagorno-Karabakh Artsakh as a part of Azerbaijan, he betrayed the democratic rights of those people. He betrayed the democratic core of the Karabakh movement. So what we're seeing now is a natural continuation of this. This is just a natural kind of continuation of this movement toward a kind of anti-democratic behavior. And I mean, also not only that, I mean, so there was this massive attack on Arthur, but in addition, even Pashinyan, one of his MPs in the parliament, even publicly denounced Arthur, and also another esteemed scholar, Armin Grigorian. And I mean, it's just terrible what we're seeing right now. And Pascal, what's amazing about this is that this is all being sponsored by the so-called democratic EU, which, as we know, it's not democratic at all. And it's kind of going full circle. I mean, its behavior is Soviet and not necessarily not in because again, Soviet Union, there's positive and negative, but in Soviet in a negative sense. I mean, when you have a daughter of a Soviet apparatchik calling the shots in EU's foreign policy, I mean, that tells you everything. So we are moving toward a reality that is rather dark
And
for Armenia and for the region.
let me just interject here, because our listeners need to know. I mean, Arthur, you are not in the first line a politician, but you are a influential or well-known IR scholar and somebody who has been involved in Armenian IR for years, right? And then you were outside of the country actually when this crackdown happened, and these priests of the church got arrested. And the reason they got arrested is because the church actually holds political importance in Armenia, because it's such an important institution. And the very next day or 2 days later, Kaja Kallas was actually in Yerevan and praising the democratic value of Yerevan and Armenia being part of the West and being part of liberal Europe. Can you speak to this nonsense just for 1 second for people who still have a brain left to think about this?
The West has lost all credibility. The West has lost all credibility, and the notion of democracy has lost all credibility, because we can see how easy it is to hijack a country, especially a country as poor and small as Armenia, and not very significant in international politics, as Armenia. It's very easy to hijack it by pouring hundreds of millions of dollars into that country, by sponsoring and then seizing the local media, by training local journalists, hundreds and hundreds of them. You basically turn this country into your colony. It's an informational annexation. You annex the country informationally. So you basically start managing this country. You have it at your fingertips because you use your money, your wealth, to completely seize control of the media, of the public opinion, and you can easily manipulate it. So basically, this is the end of democracy for me. I mean, I could see that, we talked about this before. I was a big believer in liberal ideas and a great supporter of Western democracy, but now it basically just, it went like that. It just popped in front of my eyes. It is so shameful for a representative of Europe to come to Armenia and say that this is done in an effort to promote democratic reforms, massive repressions. And it's so shameful for the so-called French president. France is a country I love. It deserves a better president. To say that this is done again to strengthen democracy in Armenia as people are being beaten up, there are bombs thrown at them, peaceful demonstrators, young people being choked for carrying a flag of their own country. A woman was arrested, Pietro will correct me, a woman was arrested with a baby who was 8 months old, and they dragged her to jail. And then Kallas comes there and gives us a lecture on democracy. I used to think that there's a link. Go ahead.
I want to interject something too, Arthur, too. There was also the famous case here in Armenia, and Arthur can speak to this, where we had this young woman, Shakarian, and she was pregnant actually, and she was hit by Pashinyan's motorcade.
They didn't even stop. Didn't even stop. No one stopped. In the US, they would be sued, and in Europe, they would be in court for not helping a person who was dying and needed their help. And here you have all these so-called free media, Radio Free Europe, the state television, the so-called civil society, hundreds of NGOs, and they all remain quiet. They are all completely quiet. This is the end of democracy. This is the end of the West. They have completely discredited themselves. And I am so glad that finally we have another center of power forming in Shanghai that's going to balance this unseemly, this unspeakable orgy of lies and hypocrisy and aggression. And I am just really, really tired of it all?
Well, I think it's also, I mean, we talk about another center of power developing. I mean, we talk about, like, Beijing, we talk about China, but it's not only that. Actually, what we're talking about is really kind of a multilateral, multipolar world order. So it's not even just necessarily one center specifically. You also have Moscow, you have Tehran, and that actually is what real democracy is all about. It's a real democracy. If we talk about international politics, real democracy is hearing multiple voices of all these states. It's not about the diktat of Kaya Kallas or the diktat of EU. It should be about, in the sovereign decisions of all these different countries. That's the fundamental of democracy. And I think, unfortunately, what we have really is raw great power politics. And that's what we're seeing now, that the EU is acting as an appendage of kind of the US, maybe imperial interests, we can say, in the Caucasus to kind of create that middle corridor to get the energy riches of Central Asia and so on and so forth. So it has nothing to do with democracy. It's about countering Russia, countering China, countering Iran. It has nothing to do with democracy at all. I mean, if it did, I would be genuinely impressed.
No,
And democracy is an idea, in my view, democracy as an idea will not die. But the use of democracy to advance imperial agendas, that I think people are beginning to see through. They're beginning to see through the mask of this situation. The mask is off.
It is a mask.
When they disguise everything in terms of democracy and human rights and liberalism. I mean, even with the U.S., when they talk about human rights and democracy and liberalism and freedom and all that, well, I mean, they're co-signing a genocide in Gaza.
Yeah.
So I mean, what about the human rights and the human values of the Palestinian people? I mean, that's completely. So yeah.
Currently what we are seeing, I mean, this is going to get much worse before it gets any better, because right now the EU is just telling us, look, this is what happens to anyone who doesn't play ball. We're going to do this. So, and they did things like this over and over. I mean, the elections in Romania, they keep doing this now. They're now sanctioning EU citizens, right, under the guise of like sanctioning Russia. And in Armenia, they're now this is now a very strange example. I mean, Gaza is already an example. Like if European and American leaders don't like it, then even a genocide can be excused and can be rationalized away. And you're on the bad side of history if you don't support the genocide. In Armenia, the weird thing now is that we have a strongman leader who cracks down Stalinist style. Usually what these people do is then they have a very bellicose foreign policy, and they rally the military in order to gain whatever it is. But Pashinyan is doing the opposite. He's doing this is dictatorial crackdown in order to sell out the Armenian homeland. Nagorno-Karabakh being one, the Zangezur corridor now being the other one. And I mean, we hear how the Azerbaijan is saying, like, look, Armenia is not a real country. Armenia is actually West Azerbaijan, right? So Arthur, can you speak a little bit to that?
Well, this is precisely why they attacked me, because this is what I said. After they went to Washington and they gave in to all the demands of the opposite side, I said, this is very dangerous. We're now beginning our descent into disintegration. We will no longer be a viable state. We will be surrounded. We have no access to our allies. And after I said that, this attack happened. Yes, you're right. It is a little bit strange that he is being such a dictator to his own public, to his own public within Armenia, but outside of Armenia, he just gives in to all the demands. But I think in a way it has its own logic. What we see here is a war for the sphere of influence war between great powers. And what happened, Armenia conceded this corridor, so Turkey and Azerbaijan can now join. It is my conviction that in the future they will be able to gradually take over the rest of Armenia, because Azerbaijan is saying you are Western Azerbaijan, so you don't really belong here anyway. So this is a major win for Azerbaijan, Turkey, for Israel, and for the United States. And this is a major blow to Iran and Russia. So for Iran, this means potential U.S. presence on its northern border, being cut off from Armenia and Russia, significantly increased Israeli presence on its northern border and in Azerbaijan. For Turkey and Azerbaijan, this means that Southern Caucasus is basically now theirs. It's their sphere of influence. Russia is being pushed out of the region. Russia and Iran will potentially be separated from each other. and bypassed. As Pietro mentioned, all the oil and gas and all these communications are going to go through Azerbaijan and Turkey, bypassing Russia and Iran. And it means the potential, the future potential of NATO expanding into the Caspian Sea, because Azerbaijan will very soon become part of NATO if this current trend continues. Then Russia will have NATO along its southern border, on the Caspian Sea, and then connecting to Central Asia. So it's exposing Russians, as they say, soft underbelly, and they'll have a lot of opportunities to drag Russia into another Chechnya, another Dagestan, basically provoke her in all these little regional conflicts, which is what the West tends to do. And there will be a potential for another attack on Iran. But I think he gives in to all these demands. This is dictated by the West in an effort to push Russia out of the region. This is why he conceded Nagorno-Karabakh. I was in favor of some kind of a compromise solution whereby Armenians could at least live on their land. But he gave it away. He went to Prague, and under pressure from Macron, shamefully, under pressure from Macron and Jean-Michel, he just signed it off. He said, you know what, just forget it. He didn't even demand any security guarantees for Armenians. This is done under Western pressure. Armenia is being sacrificed as a small, insignificant country, gobbled up by its neighbors, and the West pushed for it because the West wanted Russia out of the Caucasus. It is unspeakable.
Yeah. Well, I also want to just kind of add on to that too. When we talk about kind of these issues with like Chechnya and Dagestan that Russia has had in the past. Well, I mean, if Azerbaijan joins NATO, imagine the possibilities there, because Dagestan shares a direct border with Azerbaijan. So there's immense possibility for destabilization, for Russia being kind of, I guess you could say, surrounded. Also, again, as Arthur mentioned, with Iran too, Iran's position is much more vulnerable in this new context. Although that being said, I don't think Russia and Iran are completely out of the game. They still have cards to play. And so it's not this game, this so-called great game, is not over yet. Russia and Iran will defend their interests. But Pashinyan presents a very significant strategic problem. I mean, he is the one who is creating kind of this security dilemma for Russia and Iran in the region, effectively. I mean, by opening up the region to Turkey and Azerbaijan and to NATO and to Israel and the United States, it's not going to be a scenario that ends very well. As you know, Pascal, there was recently this kind of corridor project that was this declaration, we can say, for peace that was concluded between Armenia and Azerbaijan, between Pashinyan and Aliyev in the White House with President Trump, the Trump corridor. So now the Zangezur corridor is being rebranded as the Trump corridor, right? And the thing about this is that the State Department openly said this is directed against Russia and Iran. You have some fools here in Armenia who believe that, well, if the Americans are there on a 99-year lease, then that Azerbaijan won't dare attack us. Well, that's foolhardy, because look at the logic. Look at, Azerbaijan, like I said, look at where their interests are in Washington, with the Israeli lobby, with the military industrial complex, with the energy, lobby. I mean, look at Exxon and Baku getting together. And also, in addition, that's not even counting the longstanding relations between BP and Azerbaijan. So, I mean, this whole idea, but fortunately, there are many, many sober people in Armenia who are seeing through this. And I just spoke with a gentleman the other day from Goris, which is a town in southern Armenia in the Sunni region, and also known as Zangezur, where he was basically saying, the South is against Pashinyan, so we'll see. I mean, the Armenians are against Pashinyan. I mean, we see Pashinyan's ratings are very low. They're at historic lows, but will they mobilize? Will they mobilize to stop this? Because he is, like I said, he's betraying the nation, he's betraying the Armenian people, and he's betraying democracy. So any idea that, because even his supporters say things like, the longer he stays in power, the more democratic Armenia is, which is completely ridiculous. It's just like, those apologists for Zelensky or Maya Sandu who justify their autocratic actions by this idea of so-called democracy, but it is not democratic at all. And Pashinyan, as I said, betrayed the principle of democracy, and we see where it has led Armenia.
Yeah, but it's the weird thing.
Let me just quit.
Yeah, okay, Arthur.
So sorry. Okay. If you remember, we talked in one of our conversations about equilibrium and balance versus domination. What we see here is, again, the world returning to war, to struggle for domination, and all of it is a result of the tragic mistake made in the 90s to exclude Russia from the security architecture of Europe and to expand NATO, condemning republics like ours to being fought over and being part of a war of a sphere of influence. And your humble servant has written precisely these things in 1997 or 95, I don't remember anymore. I said, first of all, there will be another war. The Iron Curtain will move. We'll have another division of Europe. And small republic like ours will become victims of this new war. And this happened. And it's very easy to predict that there will be, when you push Russia out of Europe, you're going to create a new division. And then countries like Ukraine will be bleeding themselves dry as a result of this. Armenia suffered as a result of this. Georgia, Azerbaijan, our neighbor, won, but they still paid a price for it. This is what happens when great powers start fighting over spheres of influence. And when do great powers start fighting over spheres of influence? When you have this struggle for world domination. All of it is the responsibility of that fanatical camp that's called neocons. All of it is their fault. Our blood is on their hands. Ukrainian blood is on their hands. Georgian blood, Azeri blood, all of it is a result of their ridiculous obsession with the idea of dominating the world. And that's actually ending right in front of our eyes.
Yeah, but it's ending in a horrible crash for many places, except for these neocons who are like very safe, like living in Washington and New York, being part of the think tank world, and thinking that they are so smart when they talk about how to divide the Caucasus and when they know where these countries actually are. It's really disgusting. Also, when you listen to people like Ben Hodges and others who just talk about these places like dominoes and then vilify Russia into basically themselves, right? You can see how they see themselves in that thing. And but anyhow, about Armenia, this pivotal thing right now that still is difficult to make sense of is how Armenia and Azerbaijan too, they changed over the last 10-15 years. Kind of, I mean, I didn't notice that Armenia under Pashinyan became so self-destructive. And because the 30 years ago, of course, Nagorno-Karabakh was held by the Armenian army, right? It was able to keep that. On the other hand, there's an Azerbaijani enclave, of course. I mean, there's enclaves on both sides. Also, like, this is one of the problems that was less bad when everything still was inside the same Soviet Union, right? When everything was inside the same political setup. But now that it's divided, you have this, and this power balance shifted. How did that happen?
Pietro, I'll let you go. And
you want me to kind of jump into that?
Please. Sure. I don't want to.
No. I think a lot of it. Yeah, no. I think a lot of it goes back to this idea when we talk about kind of the power imbalance that, I mean, there was, of course, you could say that Azerbaijan for many years, it goes back to the 1990s when Azerbaijan really kind of struck what they call the deal of the century, where basically they brought Western energy companies into Azerbaijan to exploit the energy resources. And they began developing very strong ties with the West. So, and also in particular, especially when we get into the 2000s, Azerbaijan began to develop ties with the neoconservative movement in the United States, began to develop ties, began to develop very strong ties with Israel, an alliance with Israel, even with an eye toward using Azerbaijan against Iran. So that's kind of the history. But in the meantime, there was concern in Armenia that can we hold, Nagorno-Karabakh? And actually, the thing I also need to kind of just make a slight correction that indeed the Armenian army was backing Nagorno-Karabakh, but Nagorno-Karabakh was its own republic, that it had its own parliament, it had its own self-defense forces, but they were being supported by Armenia. It's a very important distinction to make because this conflict is not simply it's not a conflict of about territory. It's not about Armenia's, let's say, territorial ambitions or something. It's, again, fundamentally, it's about the right of the self-determination of the Karabakh Armenians to determine their own future. And so Armenia was supporting them, not only politically, but even militarily in this regard, although they did not officially recognize Nagorno-Karabakh as an independent state. But nevertheless, there had been, under the previous presidential administrations of Armenia, or what Armenians call, as Arthur would tell you, the Third Republic of Armenia, because there was a First Republic in 1918, and there was the Soviet Republic, which is the Second Republic, and now this is the Third Republic that we're in. And basically, there was kind of this idea that we had to kind of make some compromise. And, there were even actually some pretty good ideas, especially compared to now, where, for instance, you had Lavrov's plan, where basically you would have like Nagorno-Karabakh kind of determining its own future with the districts of Kelbajara and Lachin, which provide an overland link to Armenia. There was all sorts of kind of different ideas. There were all sorts of kind of different ideas at play, potentially. But the main thing is that once Pashinyan came to power, Pashinyan basically decided to take a very hard line on Nagorno-Karabakh. He said, Nagorno-Karabakh is, Armenia, Artsakh is Armenia, Yeverch, and that's all. But I think, especially in retrospect now, we can see that was almost done. You could almost say that was done really to kind of provoke this conflict. So it would give Pashinyan a good excuse to give away Nagorno-Karabakh, Artsakh, in such a way that he could then blame the Russians. And then in that way, because if you go back to his deep history, if you go back to Pashinyan's so-called journalistic history, if you go to Hypocrisy Jamanak, let's say, which is his newspaper, so-called newspaper, because is it really news? That's a big question. We go back to journalism of the United States at the turn of the century, and that's really what we're dealing with. That's the kind of news he was peddling. And Pashinyan was always of the opinion that what Nagorno-Karabakh and the Artsakh Armenians, basically that they were a burden. To hell with their rights, to hell with their democratic freedoms, that they're a burden. If we just get rid of them, then we can have the fruits of the West and all this and that. So that's what we're really talking about. There was I believe, a purposeful weakening of Armenia. And now that process continues with the repression of any kind of voice of dissent against this policy with regard to, Armenia's security in Nagorno-Karabakh, also with Zangezur corridor, because again, when we talk about the Zangezur corridor, Pashinyan said, of course, we're not going to compromise on that. And now, all of a sudden, he's willing to give it away for 99 years to the United States, and at incredible risk to Armenia's security, especially when you look at Yerevan's position on it, and also Russia's.
And a question.
I'll be very brief, if I may.
Sure, Arthur.
Oh, good. No,
Go, please.
All right, I'll try to be very brief. So yes, as Pietro said, Azerbaijan has used its oil resources, the contracts with Western companies, to boost its economy and boost its army and change the military balance, which is perfectly logical. Armenia initially won a victory in the 90s, but couldn't keep up. And there were a lot of mistakes made by the previous governments, for sure. But I think the decisive factor, like Pietro said, was, again, there's hundreds of millions of dollars pouring into Armenia from the West, convincing people, do you want the good life? If you want the good, sweet, Dolce Vita Western life, you got to get rid of the Russians, because the Russians are bad. The Russians are corrupt. Of course, we're not corrupt. We elect a president with donor money, and then they stand behind him with their arms crossed like this, saying, I own you, basically, the US president, whatever. So you want the good life, you got to get rid of Russia. How do you get rid of Russia? You have to give up this enclave, because as long as you have this enclave, Russia has you on a hook. So you got to give them up. And this propaganda has been going on for many years. Do you want the good life? Then you should surrender. This is what the West did to Armenia. This is, Pietro is absolutely right. I was always in favor of a compromise solution whereby the Azeris could return to their villages, Armenians could return to their villages. There were many proposals on how to resolve this in a peaceful way. But I agree with Pietro. He provoked this war. And then he deliberately didn't even mobilize the army during the war. He led us to this defeat deliberately, and then he gave up this region. Again, this was all this Western argument, among other people who pushed this on Armenia was the head of MI6, who had several meetings with him, saying, do you want to be part of the West? You have to give up this enclave, and you have to push Russia out of this region. Then we'll give you some candy. And now they are not even giving us that. But just to finish, if you want to talk about this globally, why is this happening? 1789. This is the French Revolution. This is the era of nationalism. When you have a region where ethnic groups are mixed together, and when you come up with the idea that every ethnic group should have a state, or a state should be based on an ethnic group, basically ethnic nationalism. When you come up with this idea, this is basically an open call to murder. So you have groups A, B, C, and D living together on a certain territory, and then you say, all right, every group can have its own state. So they're going want to basically slit each other's throats. And this is what happened between us and our neighbors. We lived peacefully in the Soviet Union for 70 years. As Pietro said, there were some good things about the Soviet Union. We also mentioned this. One of the good things was that we were living in complete peace and harmony with our neighbors. We had Azeri friends. Azeris had many, many Armenian friends. Hundreds of thousands of people lived in both republics peacefully. But, globally, this is a result of this idea of ethnic nationalism coming to an ethnically diverse region.
Yeah, it's absolutely toxic. And of course,
Yeah.
everything that
Well,
Israel is about is. Sorry, let me just one thing. Like everything Israel is about is, of course, this extreme Zionist nationalism, right, and ethno-nationalism. And we see how this is being fueled time and again. And we see how these forces blew up Yugoslavia in a very bloody war of people, Serbs and Croats, who used to live not only in villages next to each other, but next door, literally. And they were fine for many decades and hundreds of years until they were not. And this is being fomented now. And the two questions I have, but I'll give it to Pietro just after this. How did this guy Pashinyan get elected, and how did he get powerful in the first place? And secondly, this treaty. I mean, if it is a treaty that they signed in Washington, and I don't know because I haven't seen it, I haven't read it. I wonder if you have. If it is a treaty, then it should of course go through Parliament to be ratified. Just the signature of a president or of a prime minister doesn't mean very much. Maybe you can speak to that, but Pietro first.
Okay, so first, a few things. That it's okay. So yes, this kind of, I guess, like hyper ethno-nationalism. Of course, it's very destructive, but that also we should not exclude. That it's good, to have like some degree of like national pride. And in the Soviet Union, there was this kind of a balance that they were saying, famously, because I had researched the Soviet Armenian history in the post-war period, and especially the thought. In 1954, Anastas Mikoyan, a famous Soviet Armenian statesman, flew to Yerevan, and he called for the rehabilitation of the poet Yegesh Charents, who was a victim of Stalin's repressions. But he also said that we should reject both national chauvinism and national nihilism. So yes, of course, we should absolutely reject that kind of form of nationalism that is chauvinistic, that is aggressive, that is against, that excludes kind of the ability to kind of live peacefully together, and I guess you could say coexist. But also at the same point, it's also important to kind of embrace the differences and embrace the different national cultures. And, it's okay to be, proud to be, let's say, Armenian, but only, again, not like to like an extreme degree. And that's actually the issue, that even though like Armenians have this reputation for being, I guess, so nationalistic, in particular in the West, in Western academic circles. In fact, actually within the Caucasus, they aren't as nationalistic as, let's say, in Azerbaijan, or even when we look at Georgia in the 1990s with Viad Gamsakhurdia, he had this whole vision of a Georgia for Georgians. So Georgia was a very multi-ethnic country. There were Ossetians, Armenians, Abkhaz, different nationalities, Azerbaijanis. But Gamsakhurdia basically said that all you people are all, interlocutors, and you should all leave. And that kind of mentality is not in any sense democratic or leads to anything positive. And you can even see that hypocrisy through the West when they're saying things like, oh, yes, we support democratic rights and so-called European values, whatever that is, and or whatever those are. And at the same time, they're supporting this petro state in Baku that is sponsoring this poisonous ethno-chauvinism that is actually, really erasing those memories of Armenians and Azerbaijanis actually getting along in the Soviet times. Half the battle, Pascal, when we look at an issue like Nagorno-Karabakh or the overarching conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan, half the battle is not just the peace between the states or the peace between the presidents, but the peace between the societies. How do you rebuild relations between Azerbaijanis and Armenians as people? Right? You can't just, I guess you can't just railroad through some agreement and expect it to make the whole region stable. There has to be a process by which these people reconcile, the societies reconcile. Pashinyan is completely overlooking that. And fortunately, we can say that this event that we saw recently in Washington, it was a declaration. It was not a peace treaty. Again, like you say, that would have to be ratified through Parliament. It would have to go through a whole process. But it was just a declaration. And part of the challenge Pashinyan faces is that Aliyev, in addition to demanding the so-called Zangezur corridor, in addition to demanding this kind of territory through Sunik, also demands changes to the Armenian constitution. So that which again makes Armenia unique, even the national symbols like Mount Ararat, in addition, of course, like I'm saying with the constitution, Mount Ararat, even discussion on genocide, on the Armenian genocide of 1915, that now basically Pashinyan is willing to sacrifice all that for the so-called good life.
And we're seeing demands that these things are cut out of the constitution, that like national symbols and mention of the Armenian genocide are cut out of the constitution.
It's most of it Turkish.
Well, he wants to basically. Yes, absolutely, and also not only that, also there's these kind of claims to. Basically there are references to Nagorno-Karabakh in the constitution, and that actually is something that Aliyev is really eager to bury. What's actually ironic is that the Armenian government is really eager under Pashinyan is really eager to bury this issue of Nagorno-Karabakh completely. And by the way, also I should say this too, that when we see somebody like, when you see, like the head of MI6 advising the Armenian government about these issues, it's very, very interesting because it was the British, actually, when we look back into the annals of history during the Russian Civil War, the British who actually were, to a great degree, responsible for this issue of Nagorno-Karabakh, because the Armenians basically were about to seize Nagorno-Karabakh in this conflict with Azerbaijan. And it was the British who told the Armenian general, Andronik, that, you should stop. No, the issue will be resolved at the Paris Peace Conference and everything will be okay. And in the end, what they ended up doing was they ended up assigning Nagorno-Karabakh at that point to Musavatist Azerbaijan. And that helped create the conditions for when the Bolsheviks came into the region. It helped kind of create the conditions for Nagorno-Karabakh to become a self-governing or autonomous oblast of Azerbaijan in the Soviet period. So anyway, it's a complicated history, and it's of course a complicated situation, but I think that this so-called effort to kind of railroad through a peace that supports the geopolitical ambitions of, let's say, the neoconservative war hawks, I don't think is going to lead to anything good.
If I may, just quickly regarding this, and then I'll answer your question. So I think it's no longer even about Karabakh. We witnessed the ethnic cleansing of Armenians, and the world is completely quiet. No one is saying anything about it. The so-called responsibility to protect, declared in 2005, turned out to be a dead letter, as we all expected. We're not even Kosovars. Nobody really cares. They're destroying churches. They're, wiped out all the Armenian heritage out of Karabakh. Nobody really cares. So this is another case of ethnic cleansing where, sadly, there were no great power interests involved. This is why it was just fine. But to answer your question, Pascal, how did he get elected? Do you remember the episode where the West and Ukraine infiltrated drones? They infiltrated Russian territory with drones and then suddenly launched these drones, and they hit the nuclear bombers on Russian airports, which was incredibly dangerous and incredibly provocative. So this is basically how he was elected. What you do is you infiltrate a country with hundreds of NGOs, and you train hundreds and hundreds of journalists, and you pay them millions of dollars, and then shockingly, they start supporting your point of view. And then you mobilize this army of basically media mercenaries at the moment when you need them, when this guy, he was known for, to take bribes from people, not to embarrass them. He would blackmail them. He would say, if you don't give me money, I'm going to tell them about your wife or something like that. This is the guy. How was he elected? He had very, very shrewd guidance from the West. He was dressed up as basically Jesus. He walked around showing everybody his wounded wrist. There was some blood on a little cast. He had cast on his hand. There was something written on it in blood. He had this very, very sophisticated advice from his Western puppeteers, how to pretend to be a victim, pretend to be Jesus. And this is when they mobilized this army of journalists, Radio Liberty, Civil Net, the state television. They were all sending messages simultaneously, just like they attacked me. It was well coordinated, simultaneous messages. Everyone is in the streets. This is a velvet revolution. Take to the streets. Get rid of the old government. Of course, there were mistakes committed by the old government. They use corruption, by the way, as one of the ways of doing this, staging coup d'etats, using corruption as though we didn't have corruption in Europe or in the US. So this army of mercenaries was mobilized at a decisive moment, just like they sent drones in Russia to hit Russian bombers. This is how he was elected. It was a massive PR campaign sponsored by the West.
Sorry, can you give me the background? Because I'm sorry, I just don't know the history of that. Can you tell me when that happened? And was it like this Maidan moment, or what's...
Yes. Oh, yes.
Can you give
Oh, yes.
the points, the data points?
I'll be very brief, but Pietro will also be able to help me out with this. 2018, April of 2018, he walked from one Armenian city to another with 10 people and a dog, and he was filmed as he did this. This was like a major PR production. He was filmed, walking to Armenia, trying to stage a revolution. There were like 15 people with him. And when they came to the capital, I looked at them and I said, these poor people, they're going to beat them up, because there were just 15 of them sitting on a bench. And then suddenly, all these media channels sponsored by the West started broadcasting these messages about this velvet revolution. Everybody take to the streets. They were showing these doing the lives, from different locations, young people blocking traffic. Enough with the corruption, enough with this. By the way, he's continuing with the corruption, just like the previous regime. He's now placing his own relatives and his own friends of his relatives and relatives of friends, and they are making millions of dollars now. So the corruption didn't go anywhere. So this is how it happened. Pietro, jump in. I'm sure you have better memory than I do.
Because my question is, like, the previous government was democratically elected, right? It was democratically elected. Then he came in 2018, and then the government actually left. I mean, because I don't recall that. Sorry.
The government conceded because the leader said, you know what? It's not worth it. I don't want to spill blood. That's what he said. I don't want to spill blood, so I'm going to concede. You take over. You're right. I'm wrong. You do this. He basically handed it over peacefully. And this guy who talked about velvet revolution and democracy is now beating up, arresting, harassing, and killing people who oppose his power with the help of the democratic NGOs and democratic embassies and democratic Western organizations. With their help, you basically killed somebody in jail in front of everybody. And the West is supporting this. Disgusting. All I can say is this is nauseating. Pietro, go.
I want to say something else too about this so-called revolution of 2018. Revolution in air quotes. We can say that. That what struck me about it, first of all, is it was very evocative of 1922 Italy. So, Arthur mentioned La Dolce Vita. There's a lot of kind of, commonalities between Armenians and Italians, right? I guess you could say that. I mean, we're both ancient civilizations. It goes back into history. But in 1922, there was this gentleman named Benito Mussolini. And basically, he had his black shirts on the street. And what did they do? They surrounded the parliament and pressured the government to make him, they pressured the king to make Benito Mussolini the prime minister of Italy, right? This is exactly what happened in Armenia, by the way, that there were these massive crowds. And initially the demand of the crowd, led by Pashinyan, was that, we are simply here to keep the feet of the president Serge Sargsyan to the fire. He promised not to make himself prime minister when he changed the constitution. But now he says he wants to become prime minister and all that. So you can understand that goal, But suddenly then the goal became, we want Nikol Pashinyan to be the prime minister, right? So there was no election. It was just the demand of the street to force the parliament to make him the prime minister. That doesn't sound very democratic, does it? So we can see even from day one, it was not a democratic operation. Another point I want to mention is how, just like Arthur says, the coordination, not only of the NGO media in Armenia, but the Western media in general, that suddenly everybody, like the switch went on and they got the message that this was something we should celebrate. This was a grand democratic, movement movement of Armenia toward democracy from autocracy. And the irony, of course, is that the previous governments, as imperfect as they were, and again, I'm not making any apologetics for anybody, because of course there were obviously very serious flaws from the previous governments, but the idea that they were autocracies is really quite ridiculous, especially compared to now, because Armenia now has never been post-Soviet Armenia has never been in a more autocratic position than it has been under Nikol Pashinyan. The other interesting thing is you had people on social media, I was one of them actually, who said that, look, look at the people who are supporting Nicole Pashinyan, that they tend to be mostly kind of like white-collar, bourgeois, NGO-type characters. But then once that criticism kind of came into play, then they got the message, and then they began to market their message to the regions, to these people who were the losers of the so-called transition in the 1990s, when there was kind of the shock therapy capitalism in the post-Soviet space, people who lost their jobs, who had a livelihood in the regions of Armenia. And Pashinyan manipulated those sentiments. So he used these populist techniques to basically say, I'm going to help you. I'm going to pull you out of poverty. I'm going to make life better. We're going to live the good life and all this and that. Now, when you go to regions, you see villages that are emptying out. You see, people who are in despair over their current situation. So that's what the reality of Armenia. I mean, that's what Armenia has become. That's the reality right now. And what's also ironic is Pashinyan. I just want to say one last thing. When he's there, acting like Mahatma Gandhi or Jesus Christ, walking from one Armenian city to the other. It's not only that. I mean, he grew a beard too, and with this bandaged hand. And also he was wearing like fatigues. He was trying to kind of channel the image of this Armenian American, hero from the first war over Nagorno-Karabakh in the 1990s, Mati Melkonia. So he was trying to kind of co-opt kind of the national and nationalist sentiments in Armenia to show that, look, I am a patriot, I am a great hero, and you should bow down to me and that kind of a thing. So he was masquerading as Mati Melkonian. He was masquerading as a great hero for Armenia. But as we can see, the reality is now coming home to roost.
I mean, we know that the West, will transform an Al-Qaeda al-Nusra leader with a $10 million bounty on his head into the president of Syria. We know that they do that overnight, just if he puts it in a suit. But I need to ask about Pashinyan, because usually what happens in parliamentary democracies is that, the leader of the biggest party, of the party that wins the majority vote, then gets to be prime minister if he has like more than 50% in parliament. But so Pashinyan actually came in and was he at least a leader of one of the political parties? I mean, was he at least previously in politics? And is he now actually a party leader? And did Armenia have like elections since 2018? Is there some electoral base that supports him?
I applaud your analogy. I too think that when you have a former Al-Qaeda leader who was killing people live, cutting their hearts out, and he's being received by Ms. Bunderlein, whatever her name is, and at the White House in Washington, D.C., to talk about democracy and human rights and international law. Are you joking? I mean, we talked about this before. We have a new phenomenon in IR theory, democratic terrorists. We now have a party of the liberal democratic terrorists coming to power, or reformed terrorists. It's just unspeakable. I mean, this guy wasn't a terrorist. Did he have a political party? Yes, the so-called civil contract. Pietro will remember better when they were formed, but I think by the time they came to power, they already had this group, again, completely sponsored by the Western funders. And like Pietro said, this was a very well orchestrated PR stunt. This was Maidan. This was the Armenian Maidan, with the only difference that we are not even 10% of Ukraine in terms of our population or our resources. And by the way, all my compassion goes out to the Ukrainian people who were played and used in this cynical attempt to use their desire to join Europe, to use Ukraine as Professor Mearsheimer says, bulwark against Russia. And now the staggering numbers, over some people are saying even 1,700,000 killed. This is World War I numbers. There's no words for it.
Yeah.
To lie to an entire nation and then tell them that, oh, by the way, we were just kidding about NATO. Sorry, we tricked you. And Europe, well, we don't know, maybe 10 years, maybe 20. We'll see what remains of Ukraine. This is so cynical. This is so unspeakable. Armenia is not as important. We're a very small, God-forgotten republic. And anyway, back to you, Pietro.
Well, I wanted just to say, if you really want to learn about this, Pascal, you should look at this Zbigniew Brzezinski's The Grand Chessboard, because a lot of this was outlined right there. I mean, to kind of dig in that middle corridor, the importance of Azerbaijan and its geopolitical position, the importance of Ukraine, that's the big prize. kind of really more or less kind of weakening Armenia to get to that middle corridor. So much of this is in Zabig's book, actually, if you go back to that whole history. But even, I just want to say this about Pashinyan. Pashinyan was a lot like kind of in the genre of kind of like Alexei Navalny, or kind of one of these kind of leaders who really did not have really significant popular support in Armenia. And he could not win an election handily by any means, before the so-called revolution. People were very skeptical of Nikol Pashinyan, even within the Armenian opposition itself, or the opposition at that time. And so he used this, he used the so-called revolution to propel himself to power. And then later on, they held elections after he came to power, once he became the prime minister. And of course, those are elections that are, subject to administrative resources. And it's also kind of coming on the wings of the so-called feel-good moment because again, it's just like Maidan. I mean, it's one of these things that's marketed to make people feel good, to make them feel that we've achieved something great, we're against the corrupt government and and all that. But even then, I can also say, Pascal, there was a slow drumbeat leading up to these events in 2018. You had oh my gosh, you had the Meshtut Spark protests. Arthur can, kind of remember. I mean, he remembers this, I'm sure.
I remember some of it. There were some protests, electric Yerevan protest, etc.
There was, yeah, Afi Hovhannisyan. There were different people like this who were kind of in the lead up to Nikol Pashinyan. But that was kind of, again, like I said, the slow drumbeat. But Pashinyan coming to power, I mean, this was somebody who did not have a significant following in Armenia. And the fact is that this whole revolution was marketed. It's like manufacturing consent. This was a marketed revolution. And it was kind of a way to do a color revolution with no color, because what they were trying to say is that, oh yes, this revolution, it's not aimed against Russia. There's no geopolitical context. That's a direct quote, by the way. No geopolitical context. They did the same thing. Tikhanovskaya did the same thing in Belarus. That this is not against you, Russia, and and of course that ended in a much different way in Belarus. But there was this effort to try and frame it as a kind of a so-called colorless color revolution, that there is no geopolitical context. And this was, I think, the greatest deceit of all, if we can say that. So now, again, the reality is coming home to roost. There's very serious geopolitical threats facing Russia and Iran in the region. And Russia and Iran will not take this lying down. So, yeah.
Just to sum it up in a sentence, so what we have now, it was, like Pietro said, a major PR stunt, a huge PR operation and stunt. We're using someone who had absolutely no following, absolutely no standing, was not a politician. He couldn't even graduate from college. He dropped out after the first year. He couldn't even, complete his studies. So it was a major PR action. So just to sum it up, we have someone who comes to power in 2018 saying, I love you people. I worship you. You are the proud people of Armenia. We're going to have 3 million prime ministers here, and I will consult you on everything I do. He said that, and I heard it because I was there. And what do we have? Secret negotiations behind our backs, the surrender of Nagorno-Karabakh, the surrender of Megri, massive political repressions. And now we have someone who says, the state is I. L'État c'est moi. We have a new Louis XIV in Armenia. He's saying that there is going to be no judge in Armenia who will dare go against my will, and there will be no one in this government who will dare go against my will, because I'll fire them like that. And fire them he does. He even fired the head of the Armenian KGB. So we have this tyrant who came to power 7 years ago with Western support, shamefully, promising us democracy, and he brought us to Stalin's 1930s.
How does he rule? Because in a parliamentary democracy, you need a majority of parliament to stand behind you, otherwise you fall. So how is the parliamentary arithmetic working? Why is it working in his favor? Why has nobody chased him out of his goddamn seat?
Pietro, I
can answer that because... Yeah, in 2018, what happened was he basically, I mean, again, he had the power of the street, and he was able to use that power of the street to kind of win elections and to win them overwhelmingly, like in a super majority way. So now basically the parliament, I mean, since he was initially elected, and then again, he was, re-elected in 2021, even after the defeat in Nagorno-Karabakh, where basically you now have a parliament that, yes, there is an opposition, kind of a significant opposition, but not so substantial that it could really create a fundamental challenge. So you have like a rubber stamp parliament, effectively. that has developed under the so-called civil contract party, which is, again, even the name civil contract party is like a joke because it's not about, I mean, they don't care about the citizens. They're not interested in their democratic rights. They certainly weren't interested in the Artsakh Armenians' rights. And then next on the plate will probably be the people of Sunik, and then maybe the people of, I don't know, Davush or whatever. And it's just going to keep going like that. And so, yeah, I mean, but he has basically the bottom line is he was able to use a Ministry of Resources to elect his party to get a supermajority. And now it's like he is just like exactly what Arthur says. You know, the state is me. That's what he exactly said. That's an exact quote. And it sounds like it came out of France. I mean, when we go back deep into the history there, but it's true. He said this. He actually said.
He rules using the massive propaganda machine that's been given to him and financed by the West. They work with him on a daily basis from America, from England, from Europe. They call him, they tell him what to do, what to say, and they send him money so he can turn on this hypnosis machine, and he keeps telling our people, it's a good thing to surrender. Just give it up. We're going to live in peace. Give this up. Give this up. Just surrender here. Who cares about Karabakh Armenians? It's the past. We need to get rid of them. He's doing this only because he has this massive machine. Massive propaganda machine sponsored by the West. Let this be a lesson to all those people who believe that some wonderful guy is going to come from the West with Western money and turn their country into a democracy. Well, how is it, Pietro? You're the historian. Beware of Trojans bearing gifts, or beware of Greeks bearing gifts, whatever. Whoever bearing gifts, promising you.
Beware of Greeks, but yeah, that's the same concept. Yeah.
Yeah, just be very careful.
Well, it's a Trojan horse. Yeah. Greek.
It's a Trojan horse. Yes.
Yeah,
be very careful. Yes. Yeah.
It's just, but this is okay. Thank you, because this now explains why he's cracking down. Because now the cracks in society become obvious, and the non-national cause of his politics become obvious. Therefore, now you need to take out the opposition voices, because the opposition voices could, of course, try to do something that he did in 2018, right? They could try, and you need to make sure that that never happens. Therefore, you need to take out the other potential centers of rivalry, including, and most importantly, the church, which has a lot of weight. So you take them out in order to then impose until you have the fait accompli, probably, which is the complete sellout of the Armenian nation, I suppose, because that's what current Western interest.
I think we're on our way to
and also now
integration and losing our statehood. Yes.
Also, it's quite interesting how the Western playbook is really. I mean, it's like so predictable because, again, like, Pashinyan, when he came into power, he kind of came in as like almost like this kind of, I guess you could say, of interesting fusion there between Jesus Christ and Che Guevara. And the similar kind of image was kind of made up for Vladimir Zelensky. I mean, when we look at Zelensky in Ukraine, is that you can see that basically that same kind of image of kind of the tough kind of, revolutionary leader, that was transported also to Zelensky, even down to the point that he grew a beard, just like Pashinyan. So the same playbook is being repeated over and over, and also in terms of the authoritarianism, in terms of in terms of this kind of autocratic behavior. You see that with Maya Sandu in Moldova. She's doing the exact same thing, and she's getting the rubber stamp of okay from von der Leyen and company in the EU. So yeah.
It's absolutely amazing. It's absolutely incredible. And also the characters that they find. Again, an Al-Qaeda, Al-Nusra head chopper, a actor who literally played being the Ukrainian president, a journalist, a tabloid journalist, and
yes,
and that then is democracy. When these people stay in power forever, that then is democracy. It's yeah.
This is where FDR comes in. Remember what he said about Somoza? He is a son of a bitch, but he is our son of a bitch. We have 1953 in Iran, the coup d'etat organized by the UK and America against a democratically elected prime minister. We have Salvador Allende, who was killed with the CIA's help in Chile. We have Operation Condor. We have a lot of nasty things. I mean, all empires do nasty things. It's not just the Americans or the Brits. But they got to own up to what they did to Armenia. We're about to possibly lose our statehood because we became a card in the hands of the great powers in this war for a sphere of influence in the Caucasus.
What a tragedy.
Also, just to add one thing there is that really when you talk about, the overthrow of Allende, or you talk about, Mossadegh in Iran in 1953, that was the old way of doing things, right? Well, the new way of doing things is you take a journalist, dress him up as a revolutionary leader, and you have an NGO engineered a so-called revolution. That's the way we do coups in the 21st century. So
point.
the
Excellent.
but the objectives are still quite the same.
And that, ladies and gentlemen, is why you need control of the funding of your NGOs, just as Georgia has implemented. That, ladies and gentlemen, is why you need to make sure that foreign money doesn't buy your local resources. It's a very sad realization, but Arthur and Pietro, I would like to thank you, and we will have to discuss this again. And I wish you both all the best in Armenia and hopefully going back to Armenia, Arthur. Any last thing you would like to add?
If I end up in jail, I'll just write letters to you, Pascal, and then you can air it. Pietro can read them for you. I'm joking. It was a joke.
No, this is not a joke anymore. This is on the cards.
I just want to say this, that there is, it's not that there is some silver lining, that that the Armenians, they will fight back against this. They do. Like every nation, they have their they have their limits. There's only so much they can take, and so it's going to eventually. I mean, Pashinyan, if there's one constant in history we know, it's that there's change. So he's not going to be there forever. But right now, I mean, he's done a lot of damage, and if he stays longer for Armenia, it's going to be a disaster. That's all I have to say. Let's hope for the.
Let's hope positive change comes soon. Arthur Katchikian, Pietro Shakarian, thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you so much, Pascal.
Thank you, Pascal. Merci, Shot.